And then after all of that kind of healing occurred, he went to a foster home. And so he was with the foster home for a year and then finally got adopted, only to discover not long after the adoption that they didn't really want to be parents after all. So little Michael, who's now 4 years old, has known more than his share of hardship and heartache. And so when they went to pick up Michael, they thought, we could have some problems, some real challenges with this child, given the kind of trauma that he's gone through. And so they went and they met him, and he was a bit shy, but all of a sudden he just reached out his hand and they shook hands and he said, let's get going. And so off they went. And they've just found that instead of him being depressed and within himself, he seemed to be almost gregarious. He seemed to be engaged. Anytime a hardship might happen, instead of coiling within himself, he actually became more animated. And he would laugh and he would... While it dawned on Terry and Deb, he never cries. He never acknowledges sadness. Every time something, he defaults to this other place. This is the protective shell that he's built around himself to deal with all of the heartache that he's gone through. And as Deb and Terry went to some experts and they thought about it, they thought, we have to free him from this very cave that he's in. It looks really interesting. He's gregarious and friendly and fun. But if he doesn't deal with all that heartache inside, he'll be a prisoner forever. So Deb started with him sitting in front of a mirror, and she would simply make sad faces. And she would talk about some of the things that made her sad. And then she would ask, Michael, what makes you sad? And for a while, he didn't render very much. He practiced the facial expressions, but didn't ever really open that floodgate. And as they tried that more and more, finally he began to trust. And so one day, Deb actually said, Michael, I know your mom hit you, and I know you remember it. That makes you very sad. Tears welled up, and then he got funny again, but he couldn't keep it going. And finally, the floodgates opened. He crossed that bridge and he began to open up about the things that really made him sad. And she every time hugged him and said, I will be your mom forever. It's okay to talk about what frightens us and what makes us sad. Let's keep talking about it. So then he'd mentioned that his new dad, the adoptive dad, wouldn't let him take a fishing pole, and he couldn't take it anywhere, and he really wanted to carry it everywhere. And so he was very sad about that. And then he was always anxious about having to put on white socks because he was never allowed to go hardly outside, but never to get his socks dirty. So Terry took him outside, and they jumped in puddles and got their feet all muddy and giggled and laughed and brought them in. And as Deb held him, he cried again. And for a few days, it was this kind of cycle where he would try to go to his defense mechanism, and then as she encouraged him, he was able to unravel all of that hurt and all that sense of abandonment. And it's because Deb just made him feel so secure that he was able to do that. Gradually, he managed to get back into the light, into the truth, instead of that protective shell that he had built for himself. Not unlike the cave that Elijah went into. Now let's just think about Elijah. You know, just refresh our memories. I'm sure you know everything exactly, but just remember Elijah. He was a prophet called by God. He does remarkable things. He goes to an area and prophesies that the king, who really does not like this prophet Elijah, and especially his wife Jezebel, can't stand Elijah already, and then more unfolds. He predicts that they're going to die in a particular way. read Kings, if you can get through it all the names especially, and you will see that his prophecy comes true. He works with a woman whose son dies, and he brings that son back to life. I mean, God is so actively engaged in his life. But then I'm sure you'll remember the showdown. Mount Carmel, Elijah, he's doing battle with Baal because King Ahab and Jezebel worshipped many gods, not just the God. Lightning and thunder and all kinds of things. And so many prophets believed in him as well. So Elijah, having that sense of God's leading, declares a showdown on Mount Carmel, and they were to be there. And the plan was, you prepare an oxen for sacrifice, and we will do the same, and we'll see what God brings fire to make that sacrifice work. Well, Baal's prophets dance, they do incantations, they do everything, and they do all the kind of prayer they can think of, gnashing of teeth, falling to the ground. At the end of the day, they fall exhausted. Nothing has happened. Baal has not brought fire for this sacrifice. And so Elijah just pours it on, pardon the pun. He gets his prophets to gather up jugs of water. 3 times they douse where the fire should happen. And so everyone's sitting back and thinking, this God can't do this. And then you know the end of the story. God does. God brings this fire, and the fire is ignited, and everyone begins to worship this God, and all of the prophets in the end of Baal are put to death. Now, you can imagine that didn't please Jezebel, particularly Jezebel, and so she says, by the end of tomorrow night, Elijah's gonna die. And she was planning it and plotting it and figuring out how it would happen. And Elijah gets the word. Now, this is the guy who is able, with God, to bring fire, to bring a child back to life. God has been actively engaged in his life in very concrete ways. What does Elijah do? Does he stand his ground? No. He hears that he's going to lose his life, and he hightails it out of sheer fear of his death, and out he goes and out into the desert. And as the Bible tells us, God continues to care for him. An angel comes to him twice. He finally sits under a bush and says, I'm going to die. I might as well just die. And he's said, it's too much. But no, God keeps continuing to give him nurture, and 40 days he wanders. You'll want to pay attention to that number. It occurs in the Old Testament a lot. 40 days he wanders, which means just a long time, and he ends up in this cave. Now, I think I might want to do the same thing. If my life is threatened, by the next day I'm going to be dead, I might try to find a place to hide. And so that's where Elijah goes. And he works through all of the kinds of challenges that are going through him in the dark, in what he thinks is the protection. And he has all kinds of evidence that God is present, but in this moment, he's lost it. He can't find it. He's just overwhelmed by the threat that has come to him and all that has happened. And I think we're not unlike Elijah. We like to think that in any moment we'd stand up for God, that we would do those brave things, and yet there are many things that can frighten us, not just the threat of our own death, but just other things as well. And so we do sometimes come to understand that there are lots of triggers in our life, just like Michael had, just like Elijah, where our gut gets triggered and we start to feel that fright, and then we start to go to the place where we find a way to protect ourselves. Michael pretended. That was his safety net. Elijah runs to the cave. and hides in there, thinking that he's safe in there. We do whatever we can to try and insulate ourselves from the things that really frighten us. And so these two, the young one and this older prophet, help us to see our own human behavior and what we can do. Even when we've had God active in our life, we can have those moments where we just want to take fright. And usually if we're feeling intense feelings, if we're reacting a little more strongly than we normally would, that's usually a clue that some of the fears inside of us are being triggered. And what we can learn from Elijah and from Michael is that fear itself isn't a bad thing. If you got a bear chasing you, you want to experience fear and get out of its path. Fear is a God-given gift so that we can discern danger, so that we can understand if we're in trouble. The problem is that sometimes we don't face what's really bothering us underneath the fear. I had an experience when we were doing our CAPE units. They were counseling units as we were training for ministry. And I had the situation where we were all gathered together, and we were all supposed to speak the truth, no matter what. Well, two of the counselors, the key leaders, were going at one another, quipping, barring, that kind of thing. It wasn't an all-out fight, but you could tell they were really angry with each other, and so they were taking it out on one another in front of the group. So I thought, well, here I go. I'll either get an A or I'll flunk this course. So I finally just said, all right, you guys, take it outside. And they stopped abruptly, and they said, well, thank you for your observation. I'm thinking, oh, no, it's going to be an F for sure. And so, met with Joe, my supervisor, after, and he said, you know what, Karen? You were absolutely right. We were sparring with each other, and that was inappropriate for us to be doing that in front of the group. And then he said, but why did it bother you more than anybody else? I don't know, Joe, but I might just take a look at that and try and figure that out. And as we processed it together, I realized it had a lot to do with how I was in relationship with my parents. And I was basically saying, I'm not going to be caught in the middle. Don't put me in that situation. And that was a fear that got triggered without me even really paying attention. And it happens to us all the time. Fear isn't a bad thing. It becomes destructive when we use it to not face what's really going on. When we have stuff that's triggering us and we don't deal with it. And what's really remarkable in this story, we're looking at a faithful prophet, someone who God had shown up so many times to, and then he's hiding in a cave. And does God desert him? No. God journeys with him through that whole thing. He sends an angel twice to Elijah, gives him food for that wandering in the desert as he's trying to sort himself out and what this all means. He sends earthquake, wind, fire, which of course Baal would do, but God isn't in that. God speaks in a gentle whisper. And God says to Elijah, what are you doing here? Can't you just hear the love? It's not a judging statement that God is declaring. What are you doing here? And there's just this wonderful compassion and understanding of Elijah and what he was really going through. He doesn't abandon him. He doesn't accuse him of finally being faithless because in this moment he's not listening to God. God travels with him through all of it as he's processing why he's in that cave. And God is encouraging him, helping him to have the time that he needs to figure out what's really going on. And God is constantly present to him. I think that's a wonderful realization that we can't walk away from God because God will be with us no matter what we're going through. And so God gives him the time He gives him the chance to process, gives him the chance to sort out why he went to this place. His life was threatened before, but this was different. And so Elijah had to come to terms with it. And he said, as he sat under the bush, "It's just too much." And we can have those moments where we just don't want to do it, even noble stuff, even being a prophet. At some point, he was spent, and he had had it. Really, now I have to save my life? You can almost hear him having that sort of anxiety before God. And so he goes to hide in the cave, and God does not judge him. God doesn't scold him. God nurtures him. God whispers to him. God is gentle with him, and he eventually woos Elijah to come out of the cave and to stand in the light. And as he does, he begins to understand that God still has much in store for him. And so that's what we also need to realize. We are allowed by God to process what hurts us, what our anxieties are, what we're fearful about. But God doesn't let us wallow. God woos and nurtures and encourages us and invites us out into the light. We're not to stay in that cave forever, but that cave is the chance for us to kind of process what really is going on. And all of us have different kinds of triggers. We can be afraid of abandonment or being a failure or loneliness, or all kinds of things can be there. Just seeing that we haven't done our perfect best. We can be triggered by so many subtle hints inside of us. And that fear helps us to understand that it's being triggered. And then what God wants us to do is to work it through. You're welcome to go for a cave for a while, or you're welcome to pretend for a while, and oh wait, don't we all? We can all escape to busyness, or we can escape to a personality that is a public one. We can do all kinds of ways to avoid the truth, but eventually God woos us to face it, not to condemn us, but to liberate us. To let us be all that God has created us to be. And so God invites us to deal with those things as they come to us and process them and understand them so that we can eventually, like little Michael, stand in front of that mirror and finally set it free. What's fascinating here is that God doesn't let him away with it. He actually woos him out, has him stand in the light, and then God gives him a mission. God has more work for him to do. And so Carolyn did a brilliant job of mentioning the two kings that he's to appoint, and also the successor, who is Elijah, that he is going to go and mentor and be a part of his life for a time. And those three things were given to Elijah because he came to understand it wasn't time to die. It wasn't time to get lost in his own self-pity. It was time to process it and get on with serving God. So no matter how many times we might retreat to that cave, no matter how many times we might try to pretend or try to escape, God is there, whispering, encouraging, inviting you to be the person that God has created you to be, not captivated by anything that can hold you back or trap you and leave you in a place where you're stuck. So if you happen to hear a gentle whisper, just when that gut's starting to tighten up and you're starting to have that sense that something is really not right here, listen to the whisper. Listen to God's quiet voice of the Spirit calling you ever so slowly out into the light. Might take a couple of angel visitations, might take a bit of processing, but hear God's whisper to step into the light. Hear God saying to you in those moments, what are you doing here? What are you doing here? And then come into the light. And to God be all the glory. Amen.